suggestions, I would say identify social service uses within a quarter mile of proposed use, and consider how existing net benefit or net burden of those services might be impacted by the potential net benefit or net burden of the proposed facility. Considerations would then be the net benefit or net burden is not necessarily correlated with either the number or type of social services. The net benefit or net burden would be perceived benefits such as critical service, unmet need, increased property values, etc., minus the potential negative impacts, traffic, noise, light pollution, safety, decreased property values, etc., of any social service facility. What I think I'm saying here is that basically I think any use will have to be a conditional use. That we can try to come up with guidelines, but we don't know the situation that you're going to be fitting a facility into. You don't know what the existing neighborhood is like. You don't know what the existing burden on the neighborhood is, if any. And you don't know what the proposed facility, what the burden of any proposed facility is going to be. So I think the concentration is basically going to be site specific depending on the situation. And that's why I think it has to be conditional, and it has to be something that would be determined with a public hearing where evidence is given under oath and data is collected, and then council with their semi-judicial ability makes a determination. But I don't think that we can come up with a guideline that would do all that, because I think it is something that we can't anticipate. So anyhow, for the first part, that's, and I thought, again, I jumped in last week and said, well, we need more specificity, but I don't think we can get any more specific on the concentration, because I think it is a conditional situation. On this next section, the location consideration for recommendations, I would say taking what the subcommittee had, weigh desirable and undesirable qualities of locations to assess overall desirability of site. And then I would add for proposed use, using a distance of 1/4 mile as being proximal. Again, I said we had to define proximity, and I thought when I was trying to come up with a distance, I said, well, you could have 1/8 of a mile, 1/4 mile, 1/2 mile. For zoning, we use 1,000 feet as our standard distance for notification. 1/4 mile is 1,300 and something. So I think that's a reasonable distance. I said the ideal location should have more desirable than undesirable qualities. But how do you determine that? And at first I tried to put sort of some table where you would rate things. And I still think that's something that's doable, but I think staff probably would have to help us to do. And my suggestion would be staff should consider creating a matrix which could be used to prioritize locations, desirability of locations, much as we currently do to prioritize construction of town facilities. We have priority maps for, or priority tables for street construction, sidewalk construction, bike facilities. So we come up with a rating system, and then we add all the pros and the cons, and we come up with something, a number at the end that suggests this is the more desirable site, this is a less desirable site. So I think there is something that can be done there to rate locations, and it's something that could be, I don't know if it'd be totally objective, because how you come up with that matrix is, I guess, somewhat subjective, but it could at least have some objectivity to it. And again, the qualities of desirable and undesirable locations, I think the subcommittee hit fine. The next section, the good neighborhood or good neighbor plans, the committee said stipulate that the proposed facility demonstrate that it has a mechanism plan in place for community involvement and include the homeless community as a participant. The only change I would make there is I would add have a mechanism plan in place at the time of application, because if it's a plan has to be submitted as part of the application, it means that those discussions have already occurred, there's been some sort of agreement as to what's reasonable, and the public can actually see what is being proposed. The public can actually evaluate, you know, how are you going to deal with safety concerns? How are you going to deal with noise concerns? How are you going to deal with traffic concerns? I mean, much the same way for a SUP for a development project, we ask for a traffic impact analysis. We ask for a adequate schools facility analysis. We ask for some sort of analysis at the time of application to say that this isn't going to have a negative impact on the community. So I think having that plan in place at the time of application is critical. In the second part, the committee said provide for periodic site assessment report card. I think that's a reasonable thing. You know, I don't know what the time frame should be, whether it should be an annual report. We now have Carolina, UNC gives an annual Carolina North report. UNC gives an annual development report. OWASA at one point was given quarterly reports on their odor control because of the problem with Highland Woods with the odor problem. So I think having a periodic site assessment is important. It would be, you know, part of the plan that I think needs to be in place at the time of application. And it's a way of dealing with problems before they get out of hand, because then they come to the surface quickly. So I think, I don't know what the time frame should be, but I would say probably annual, but that's something I think could be discussed. And then under design considerations, performance standards, the only thing I had there was on the second point, the subcommittee recommended I would require the police fire department statement of any concerns that they might have for this type of service facility at the time of application. Again, I think it's important that when the application is being considered, that the public know what are the issues that the police or fire department or any other departments might have. We get a staff report with an SUP on an application, but usually it doesn't, you know, sometimes it mentions that the police or the fire department has evaluated that a site will work with their equipment, et cetera, but I don't think beyond that we get much of a report. I don't see any reason that it couldn't have something with a shelter, couldn't have a police fire department report specifying any concerns they might have at the time of application. So to summarize, I didn't have a lot of changes. I think the last two I mentioned, where you put things in at the time of application, I think would go a long way to at least solving the issue of, you know, letting concerned citizens know what exactly is going to happen and how you're going to potentially control it. The concentration issue, like I said, I don't think there's an easy way that we can come up with guidelines on something that we can't anticipate. I could envision, and I don't think you do it by numbers, I could envision where there could be 10 social services in a neighborhood and there'd be no negative impact whatsoever, that everybody's going along, everything's fine, everybody's happy. On the other hand, you could all have one social service and it could be a terrible impact. So it's you can't predict it, I think, and I don't think there's any way we can predict it and say that you're going to limit it by the numbers or you're going to limit it by the types of facilities. I think what's going to limit it is what the existing burden is on any neighborhood and what the proposed facility might bring as an additional burden, if any. And that, again, I think has to be done with data that's presented in a public hearing and that the council gets to evaluate. And I guess if I had any recommendation for that concentration, it would be that shelters be evaluated or permitted under conditional use conditions, where each situation is evaluated as a single situation, that there's no particular area where you say, oh, you can always have a shelter there. It always has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Anyhow, though, that's what I came up with. And in terms of the issue James raised, I'm not sure at this point that I could because I spent a fair amount of time trying to figure this out, and I don't know what else I could get. I don't want to hear a lot of conflicting data because I don't know which is right and which is wrong. I think it's going to be up to council in a public hearing and with staff's evaluation to look at the data and say, this is reasonable data. But I think Mike mentioned it, I don't know that we can take what other towns do. Or, I'd like to think that Chapel Hill is at least somewhat unique, and that what happens in other towns, we might take what they're doing or learn from what they're doing, but it may not be directly applicable. And again, without looking at a case-by-case situation, I don't know that, if I had a lot more time, I'd come up with anything different than where I am right now. So that's my take.
Thanks, George.
Okay,
Dale?
so I agree with just about everything George said, and I really like his revisions. I do think we should add that all shelters should be a conditional use, and I do believe that the proper venue for debating the numbers is at the council. I guess I would only want to consider one addition to what George did, which would be under good neighbor plans. I would like to consider adding for at-risk shelters in residential areas, include description of security plan, including procedure for transporting those turned away or asked to leave, transporting whatever.
Yeah, could you read that one more time?
Sure. For at-risk shelters in residential areas, include description of security plan, including procedures for transporting those turned away or asked to leave.
I did want to,
I also want, I don't know if you got it, but I would like to add also that all shelters be a conditional use as a overarching recommendation.
so for the benefit of all of our edification, so how would that differ from a special use permit, a conditional use?
Because you can have things that are permitted in certain zoning, but they still, because of their size, go through a special use permit. But I think what I guess I'm saying and what Dell is saying is that nothing is automatically permitted in any area, that any shelter would be considered a conditional
Right, because
use.
this needs an SUP because it's a rezoning.
Well, except that the ordinance changed, though, when the number was changed, it also